The morning I came back from a week-long fishing trip and found a pile of smoldering rubble where my lakefront mansion used to be, I didn't scream. I didn't hyperventilate. I didn't even call for help. I just sat on the hood of my truck, popped open a can of root beer, and stared at the disaster because, honestly, I knew exactly who had done it. Kinder Briggs, I muttered, watching her strut across the lawn like she owned the damn place. She was wearing those ridiculous shoulder pads, clutching a clipboard like it was a holy relic, and sporting that same pinched, sour expression she always wore, the one that suggested the entire world was a personal inconvenience to her. She was the president of the Lakewood Pines HOA, a woman who had been trying to make my life a living hell ever since she realized I wasn't the type to bow to her petty, arbitrary little rules. "Oh, thank God you're back," she chirped, planting herself in front of me like she hadn't just reduced my four-bedroom sanctuary to ash. "We've been trying to reach you for weeks. You were delinquent on your dues, and, per Section 5, subsection C, we had no choice but to reclaim and dispose of the property." "Dispose?" I raised an eyebrow, not moving an inch. "You bulldozed a $2 million lakefront mansion, Kinder. That's not disposing. That's a felony." "You were warned," she said, flipping through her clipboard with a smug flick of her wrist. "Multiple notices, final warnings. We followed protocol to the letter." I leaned forward, the smell of damp ash and pine hanging heavy in the air. "And who, exactly, signed the demolition order?" "I did." She beamed, clearly proud of her little power trip. "As acting treasurer and president, it was within my authority." "Right," I said, sliding off the hood of my truck and dusting off my jeans. She took a half step back, sensing a shift in the air. "But you might have forgotten one tiny detail, Kinder. I bought this entire development 3 years ago. Every lot, including yours." Her face twitched. "That's a lie. The HOA owns." "No," I interrupted, my voice flat. "You manage. I own. I let the HOA keep operating because I didn't want to deal with trash collection, lawn regulations, and all that other nonsense. You were a convenience, but now." I looked at the crater where my house used to be, then back at her. "Now we got a massive problem." "You're bluffing," she stammered, her voice cracking just enough to give her away. I pulled a folded deed from my back pocket and held it up. County registrar signed, notarized, and dated. "See that line right there? That's my name. Corin Wesley, owner of Lakewood Pines Estates. You just authorized the destruction of private property on land you don't own. That's not just a breach of contract, Kinder. That's a one-way ticket to prison." She snatched the paper, her eyes darting across the ink like she could rewrite reality through sheer willpower. Her face went from flushed to ghost white in about 3 seconds. "I'll be calling an emergency board meeting," she whispered. "You do that," I said, watching her scurry away toward her car. "But you're going to want to call a criminal defense attorney, too, because while you were playing queen of the cul-de-sac, you just bulldozed your own freedom." By the time the afternoon sun dipped low enough to cast long, jagged shadows across the scorched earth, I had already made the calls. Sheriff, assessor, and my contractor, the guy who owed me a favor the size of a new foundation. When Deputy Carson arrived, he took one look at the wreckage, pushed his sunglasses up his nose, and let out a low whistle. "Tell me that's not what I think it is, Corin," he said, eyeing the heap of splintered wood and twisted metal. "It's exactly what you think it is," I said, handing him a folder. "Demolition order signed by a woman with no legal authority on land she doesn't own. No court order, no liens, just pure, unadulterated hubris." Carson flipped through the pages, his jaw tightening. "She actually went through with it. She used an out-of-county crew, didn't she?" "Off the books, cash only," I confirmed. I checked. "If she hired them off the books and destroyed private property without a mandate, that's felony criminal damage," he said, pulling out his notepad. "You want to press charges?" "I want the full weight of the law, Carson." "You'll get it," he said, heading back to his cruiser. "This is going to be loud." As he drove off, a gray SUV pulled into the cul-de-sac, parking crookedly across 2 driveways. Out stepped Margaret Tilling, the HOA vice president, a woman who looked like she'd been sucking on lemons since the late 80s. She marched over with that insufferable confidence of someone who had never been told no in her life. "You owe this community an explanation," she snapped. "Kinder said you were hiding from your responsibilities, and now you're trying to play the victim. And you," I said, studying her, "are the one who voted to remove my property. There was no legal mechanism for that vote. Margaret, you can't vote to seize what you don't own." "That's where you're wrong," she said, lifting her chin. "We have in the bylaws. Non-payment of dues forfeits your rights." "Rights, sure. Property ownership? Never. That's not how the law works, and you're about to find out the hard way." She turned on her heel and stormed off, but the doubt was already creeping into her eyes. It was almost poetic. They had spent years building this little empire of fines and fear, and in one afternoon, they'd managed to burn the whole thing down. That night, I stayed at my cabin across the lake. I reviewed the security footage, 2 perfect angles showing Kinder shaking hands with the demolition crew, and uploaded everything to an external drive. I also drafted a formal complaint to the state regulatory board. But the real twist came the next morning when an unlikely ally emerged: Eliza, a retired school teacher and member of the social committee. She showed up at my cabin, her hands trembling as she handed me a thumb drive. "She told us you were planning to sell the land to developers who would tear everything down," Eliza confessed, her voice barely a whisper. We were scared, but when I saw what she actually did, I couldn't stay quiet. The drive contained every meeting agenda for the last 3 years. Hidden within the notes were vague references to final phase operations and discretionary enforcement, essentially a roadmap of their corruption. They had been targeting homeowners, seizing property, and pocketing the proceeds through shell companies. By the time I sat down with my attorney, Nadira Patel, a former federal prosecutor who smelled blood in the water, the case was airtight. "They're not just in trouble, Corin," Nadira said, her eyebrows lifting as she scanned the documents. "They're finished. You've got them on embezzlement, conspiracy, destruction of property, and RICO violations. I don't just want to sue them. I want to dismantle this HOA piece by piece." And that's exactly what happened. The dominoes didn't just fall, they shattered. Within a week, the sheriff's department had frozen the HOA's bank accounts. We discovered that Kinder had been funneling maintenance funds into a private account to pay for her contractors, all while billing the community for non-existent beautification projects. It was sloppy, greedy, and honestly a little pathetic. The criminal trial was a slaughter. Kinder's lawyer tried to argue she had acted in the best interests of the community, but the judge cut him off mid-sentence. "You authorized the destruction of private property you did not own, using funds you had no authority to access," the judge said, looking down from the bench with zero patience. "That isn't community service, Ms. Briggs. That's fraud." Kinder was sentenced to 6 years in state custody. The rest of the board? Fines, probation, and mandatory restitution. One of them, a man who had once spent 3 months harassing a neighbor for the color of his curtains, actually wept when he was sentenced to 2 years. Standing on the edge of the crater where my old house used to be, watching the sun set over the lake, I finally felt the weight lift. No more citations. No more passive-aggressive notes about my mailbox. No more HOA. Construction on the new house started shortly after. It was better than the last one, reinforced, modern, and built to last. But the real change wasn't the architecture. It was the people. The neighbors, once pitted against each other by Kinder's reign of terror, started talking again. We didn't need a board to tell us how to live. We just needed to be decent humans. One Saturday night, we held a bonfire. We burned all the old rusted HOA signs, the stacks of enforcement notices, and yes, even that infamous clipboard. As the fire turned it all into ash, a neighbor, one of the people Kinder had found in near poverty, handed me a drink and nodded. "Feels like the air is clearer," he said. "It is," I agreed. Some might call it vengeance, but I call it setting the record straight. Ownership is leverage, and leverage beats intimidation every single time. But it makes you wonder how many communities out there being held hostage by people who think a little bit of power makes them a god. How much of the rules we live by are just tools for someone else to control us? I'm curious, what's the craziest, most over-the-top HOA story you've ever heard, or maybe even lived through? Do you think these organizations are a necessary evil, or are they just breeding grounds for people who never got over being a hall monitor in high school? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know where you draw the line between community order and total control.